of equality, rights and law. And clearly, this can bring a perceived clash for Western INGOs between some ideological elements of political Islamism adopted by certain armed groups and extremist groups in Syria. And we know that actually liberalism itself is still contested in areas of this conflict and can be read as a forcing of Western imperialism, particularly where contesting liberalism is a core part of the conflict. So, for instance, and what does this mean for field operations? NGOs that previously worked in ISIS-held areas but had to move to new areas of operations when demands enable us to operate in a certain way that is not in line with humanitarian principles. So this is interfering with or affecting practice such as beneficiary selection, inclusions and distribution, and methods of delivery. But then this was further complicated by demands that affected, I would say, more our development ethics, particularly looking at gender division and particularly around health provision. And what that ends up happening is it's less aid for those in need in ISIS-held areas, as many INGOs took the same decision. Another example at the Tel Shabab crossing in Jordan, which is currently the only one approved by the Jordanian government that INGOs use to go cross-border into Syria. We've been requested to only use 2 or 3 local pre-approved organisations, which has many reported concerns about neutrality and the information provided through those organisations to the Jordanian authorities, including beneficiary and staff lists. I think if you could just move to the next slide. Another concern, or something that is particularly challenging in the Syrian conflict, is the history of civil society development in Syria, which is a limited number of organisations with centralised oversight, high state control, and very limited space and number of UN agencies and INGOs, mean that humanitarian principles are a new and very foreign concept to Syrian local councils, the population generally, and these kind of newly established NGOs that INGOs are using as partners to respond to the enormity of the crisis. While we've been able to train on initiatives such as joint operating principles, it's very challenging to try and ensure application of those principles when there's such a new way of thinking, particularly that relates to programmatic and financial management and monitoring and evaluation in particular. And remote management as an additional element of difficulty in terms of implementation. As I say, that access we have is very limited. For instance, for INGOs who are going cross-border from Turkey, many of us are only allowed to have up to 6 registered humanitarian staff crossing that border on a regular basis. So training on those principles, and particularly on our code of conduct principles, that's community participation, capacity building, sustainability and accountability, all those become very difficult when you're forced to use a model of remote management. 2 other things that are very specific to the Syria context, with no overarching government in northern Syria, and indeed something that's very specific to Syria generally, that all interactions are very ad hoc and localised. Local councils are very unique and they kind of implement as they like. Some are under high pressure from armed groups in terms of interaction or how they are asked to interact with the INGOs. And other local councils, such as those in Azaz, are more able to stand up for their own jurisdiction. This again raises concerns for impartiality on beneficiary selection, aid distributions, and aid reaching armed groups. These local councils are often under considerable pressure to support their communities with limited resources, where local council leaders often come from traditionally powerful families in the community. Some of these local councils will have some clear sympathies for certain armed groups and will either be aligned to them or may face intimidation from armed groups which they're not aligned to. But because, again, of lack of access and lack of kind of overarching authority figures, there's very limited alternatives than to work within these parameters. I think just the last point I'll say, again, if you could just move to the next slide, is because we operate with humanitarian principles, as Balthazar mentioned, this negotiation for access is absolutely critical. But again, in a very localized context in Syria, with a multitude of armed actors, the situation is very fluid and very fast-moving. There's a high turnover of armed actors, and those delegated representatives with whom we are asked to interact frequently change. So you may establish new relationships may be established, but then the area might change hands, or the representatives in that armed group may change. So I would say, particularly for multi-mandated INGOs, unlike perhaps the ICRC and indeed MSF, we often don't routinely internally invest in capacity building for our own staff in terms of negotiation skills. I think it's a gap that definitely needs addressing. So, which even if a relationship can be established, staff may struggle to recreate that relationship or be able to do so on a regular basis. And as we know, the lack of access in Syria is such that that negotiation is absolutely critical. Thanks.
Thanks, Francis. Can I follow up to something you said about, you know, the way you go about applying these principles in reality? Would you be able to give us a few concrete examples where, with action, you try to safeguard the neutrality, impartiality, independence of your work in the operations, and what did this involve? If you can just bring it to life with some operational examples, would be great.
Sure, thanks, Panos. It's a great question. I think one of the most concrete examples that I have is what we call transfer of liability. Again, with these bureaucratic impediments in terms of what staff we can allow to enter, what staff we can use, one of the things that we have adopted is this a transfer of liability in terms of sending of commodities. So we try where we can, given the lack of access and given how we're not able to implement in the ways we would like to implement, we transfer the risk of aid getting diverted to suppliers. That is to say, in suppliers' contracts, they're held accountable for any losses. So, for instance, at checkpoints, if certain armed groups skim off the top or take boxes or divert those commodities, we don't give cost recovery for those diverted items. And actually, since using this approach, we've had 0% of commodities diverted, which is great. But we do have to be incredibly extremely firm with all parties to the conflict. And indeed, we do need to work as a community in terms of not bending to pressure to operate in certain locations under certain conditions. Another concrete example of how we can do it, creation of joint operating principles for those INGOs working cross-border out of Turkey into northern Syria and how we engage with armed groups, has given us a common framework for engagement. This was really necessary from the INGO side, particularly as a lot of us have been operating in this way before the UN coordination system and those Security Council resolutions that authorized cross-border access for the UN arrived. And talking about this kind of cross-border versus cross-line dilemma, if you will, in Syria, we have explored the possibility of working outside Damascus in order to reach as many people in need as possible. But again, this restriction, approval of activities and bureaucratic impediments do make it extremely difficult. For instance, this year, the Syrian government expelled 3 UN staff members for maintaining contact with armed groups. And as I was discussing, you know, the reality of the situation is that we are constantly interacting with armed groups to preserve our operations across Syria. So we had to say, you know, at this time we're prioritizing working cross-border to maintain working within our principles as far as possible. But I think just to sum up, you can say that we are certainly very restricted and challenged in terms of safeguarding our principle without losing access to people, to the population in need. If we're entirely rigid, we compromise that access and it can be closed off to us. So there is this need, as Balthazar mentioned in his presentation, to look at the principles not as a standalone theoretical framework and understand that there might need to be compromises and accommodations made to reach people, and also to ensure those secondary kind of code of conduct principles, community participation, capacity building, sustainability and accountability are met. So we do have to be pragmatic. And for us, I would say that means that we would use that formula you can see at the bottom of the screen there. So being pragmatic means you take your principles, you look at your context, and that is what will shape your operational practice, or another word for operational practice would be policy. Context really has to be a lens through which to see these principles, and it's up to every organisation to determine their own flexibility, their appetite for compromise, and also indeed their capacity for context analysis. With that vital lens of understanding context through which to frame how you apply your principles, it's vital that context analysis is well done. And we'd really urge that to be the case across the board. So for instance, we'd urge that donors could support in that way, particularly in the Syrian context. You know, counter-terrorism legislation can complicate matters, and donor concerns can increase kind of bureaucratic and monitoring hurdles when that lens and need to take your principles but work out how pragmatically you can best shape your operational practice, I would say, is vital for everyone. Thanks.
Thanks, Francis. That's really very helpful and indeed complementary to what Balthazar and Mark said. I heard you talking about looking at the context, basically using one's common sense, taking the principles, keeping in mind that the objective is to reach the people who are the most vulnerable of all, the poorest of the poor, the most needy of the needy, and then to see how to apply it in that particular context as you go through in an operation. I'd like to take us now back to Kabul, back to Afghanistan. And Mark, I want to ask you a question. When we look at the principles, I mean, bottom line in every operation, what we really try to do is efficiency. So to what extent the application of the principles enhances the efficiency or hampers the efficiency of the operations? Can you give us some examples, please? Over to you.
Yes, my feeling is that applying the principles leads to greater efficiency in the sense of creating a far greater focus. In Afghanistan, I think there has been, the way we've applied the principles is to focus far more of the humanitarian response on areas that are contested where the principles of international humanitarian law apply. And to this extent, we've also focused our funding in this way. My concern at the moment is that there's a challenge to sort of the definitions of humanitarianism, which are becoming broader and broader and leading to less focus and assistance. If we apply IHL more rigorously to the areas where it really should be applied, that is areas of conflict, then I think we do get both more focus and more efficiency in terms of the way in which we undertake our programs. I think the other way in which it leads to that is also a sense of prioritization in terms of the activities that are undertaken, and with a clearer acceptance of those activities. It allows better access and hopefully a clearer understanding of the distribution mechanisms that we need to put in place to apply with those principles, to comply with those principles.
Thanks, Mark. So indeed, enhancing the efficiency is really the objective, and the respect of these principles really makes the operation a lot more effective and efficient. It's 40 minutes past the hour. I'm going to start taking questions that you have sent us, and I really want to encourage all of you to go to the Q&A box on the top right-hand side of your screen and encourage you to send us questions which we will, as a text message, which then I will take live to our panelists and ask their point of view as we're progressing with the second part of this webinar, which is going to be focusing on the questions, your questions, that are relevant to your particular context, and trying to see how to be of help. And actually, Balthazar, I'm going to ask with you, we'll start with you with a question we have received, which is also linked to ICRC's mandate to protection. And the question I have is, does respecting, applying the principles enhances the protection of the affected people? Can you give us some examples of the dilemma that ICRC may have faced in applying the principles and looking at protection of the people we're trying to help? Balthazar, over to you.
Yes, on the protection, I think the most important thing, if you talk about armed conflict here, is of course the responsibility of the parties to the conflict. they have to respect international humanitarian law. They have to prevent civilian suffering to the extent possible in military operations. And in this sense, humanitarian action, even if it tries to also to contribute to prevent such violations or to respond to the needs, inevitable needs in armed conflict, humanitarian actors cannot protect on their own. They can create an environment in which there is better protection. And I think what is very important, and Francis mentioned it also, it is really the question of proximity. Francis asked questions about how far can organizations go with remote management. We firmly believe at the Red Cross, and it's true that we have with national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies in each and every country, very often their branches being in the most unlikely places and having access to the civilian population, we have here within our movement the sort of natural partners to reach people. But I would argue that we need to insist to be on the ground to protect and to contribute to the protection and to assist people affected by war, be they wounded, be they people detained, be they people in need of water, in need of food, etc. And that means, for instance, in Syria, where we have over 60 international staff, it means trying to be in as many places as you can. We have offices in Damascus, in Tartus, in Aleppo. We managed to open an office in Homs. You have to go where the people are, where the needs are. You can't do that from a green zone. You can't do it from a neighboring country, so very, very difficult so. And you have to try, and it is extremely dangerous and difficult to be on the ground, which means that you have to be accepted. You can't intervene with belligerents and call upon them to respect IHL and to protect the population if there isn't a minimum of dialogue, of acceptance, of trust. And that is something that we have to build. If perhaps 10, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it was easier and you would sort of approach belligerents, today it may take years, namely for new actors, to accept the ICSC or to accept humanitarian action and to actually walk through all these I'd say conceptual ideas, but also highly operational ideas. And what is interesting is very often that if, for instance, a non-state armed group has control over a population, it is probably more interested after a certain while seeing all the challenge of actually also catering to the needs of a population it controls to engage with humanitarian actors that if it is an armed group that is totally on the run. So it is true that each and every context has its own, I'd say, particularities, and it is of course something that needs to be carefully built. It needs a lot of time, it needs a lot of engagement, it needs an acceptance of states that certain actors sit together with non-state armed groups that very often are considered by states to be terrorists, to be totally unacceptable from all points of view. So it needs for non-state armed groups a tolerance that a humanitarian organization, of course, is in close contact with the state that is their enemy. So it is not easy to engage these parties on all sides, and it has, of course, to yield a direct impact for the people on the ground, for the populations affected. It needs clearly also a very professional and diversified staff. It was interesting that we have seen that depending on the context, we need to have specific competencies that we can deploy. But I think it's not everything about principled approach only happens at the field level. Things are happening also at headquarters level. We can talk about fundraising. You cannot, for instance, and you must not accept tight earmarking that would make it impossible to finance impartial action. If you had, for instance, contribution that basically a donor would say, you can only work in government-held areas, or you can only work, say, for the Shia, but not for the Sunnis, that kind of tight earmarking is, of course, absolutely to be rejected, because finding the funds, unrestricted funds, in order to afterwards be able to have an impartial approach will make it possible for the field teams to deliver it. So it is actually, I'd say, an overall interconnected system that goes from communication, fundraising, engagement, humanitarian diplomacy, operational cross-line and cross-border operations. It's a coherent whole. And actually, the good news is that the parties to the conflict are well informed, observe you very closely and make determinations. And sometimes they make perhaps a very difficult determination, sometimes they don't understand you, sometimes they attack you, sometimes new actors emerging do not accept the very premises of humanitarian action. But I think there is always room to convince people, and it may take sometimes years to convince people, but actors are not static. They evolve also as conflicts evolve.
Thanks, Balthazar. Indeed, a complex situation on the ground of the operation, and this consistency, this patience over time is really what's crucial. I was recently in a very complicated and highly insecure operation in the field, and I remember meeting the head of ICRC who explained how it took him 2 years of consistent networking, bit by bit, to establish that network and explain these principles to everybody at all sides of the spectrum in order to allow the humanitarian convoys to proceed just with flying the flag and nothing else. So that's really crucially important. I'd like to highlight that we have a number of background documents that actually we will be showing on the screen, so you know that could be of use to you to use as a resource that provides some of the guidance. And the entire PowerPoint presentation will be emailed to all of you, but also this webinar is recorded and will be available on the website in the coming days should any of your colleagues who are not able to follow today would like to hear it back. I'm now going to take another question, and really I want to encourage you all to keep on sending us questions through the Q&A box. And Francis, it's a challenging question that it really comes towards you. It's a spicy question. The question is, world vision, really, obviously it has a religious connotation, and everybody knows about that. Yet it's interesting to see that you're operating in the Syria context with actors that are on the extreme spectrum of the ideology. And so the question is, how do you balance this in your day-to-day work as your vision? Obviously, perceptions are important, yet the application of the principles, and how is it working in the Syria operation in the practical manner? Francis, over to you.
Brilliant, thanks, panel. Yes, definitely a spicy question, but some interesting findings, I think, from the Syria context with regards to being a faith-based organization working in this context. I think the first thing is to say, and I'm not sure how well this is often reflected externally outside of our context, is that actually we have found that in a lot of cases, not just in Syria, but we have found that actually other faith-based organizations and NGOs actually tend to identify quite well with another faith-based organization. The actual faith in question itself doesn't seem to necessarily pose that much of an issue. Whether we're working with a Jewish-based organization or a Muslim-based organization. Now, particularly in the Syrian context and indeed the regional context, where a lot of NGOs or civil societies do tend to be faith-based, in many cases this has actually opened up doors of acceptance to us, and particularly in Jordan, working with some of the royal charities, that has been something that we found, and indeed in Lebanon as well, where they're used to working in a multi-religious context, being faith-based, is actually sometimes easier to understand than not coming from a faith-based kind of background and motivation. And the second thing to say, if this is specific to Syria now, is that the conflict we're looking at in this context is sectarian. That is to say, it's really a Sunni Shia split that is stoking a lot of the problems here, and not just within Syria, but also with neighbors and those parties involved in the conflict, including Iran and Saudi Arabia. But it's really not a struggle between a Christian and versus Islam context. And I think indeed for some extremist groups, as you're not part of their extremist ideology, they don't really care what other religion you are, even within Islam. Which brings me on to my third point. But actually what we have found that within Syria, it's actually, in terms of perception, it's more a problem to be perceived to be connected to the West rather than it is related to being a Christian organization. Being related to, let's say, a Western political agenda. And this has been particularly true since the anti-ISIS military intervention campaigns have started. that perceived link of being related to governments which are not impartial is actually more of a risk. This has led to increase in staff detentions and accusations for national staff, not just for faith-based organisations, but really across the board of all INGOs. That perceived link is very damaging. And again, it's like, coming back to what both Mark and Balthazar have said, perception is very important. And this constant advocacy that you are humanitarian and you do have these principles, and what those principles mean are very important. But it's not just a question of, saying, hey, we have these principles. You must do engagement with all parties, local councils, armed groups, governments, explaining what these principles mean, why they're important, engaging. If you don't do that, then no matter what you think of your own identity, whether it's faith-based or not, if you're not prepared to do that work in terms of engaging, explaining why you have these principles and what they mean, then of course the perception will be negative. But as I said, we've found actually in a lot of contexts our faith-based identity has actually helped us to operate. Thanks.
Thanks, Francis. Thanks for reminding us indeed of the perceptions on how to go about being operational in this difficult context. The next question I have received is really addressed to Mark in Kabul, and is really over a very sad recent event that happened. So, Mark, the question says, in the Afghan context, the recent bombing of the MSF hospital in Kunduz was really a stark reminder that advocacy of humanitarian principle is also needed to everybody, including NATO or other actors operating in such a complex environment. So can you talk a little bit about that? What action was it done to address it? And obviously that was a stark reminder of the need for respect of humanitarian actors by everybody in such an impossible situation on the ground. Mark, over to you.
Yes, I mean, I think that we were all very saddened by the attack on the MSF hospital, and more than saddened, I mean, many of us were outraged by the attack and have condemned it. It raises a number of very difficult issues. One of them is the issue of not just the lack of recognition of the hospital, but also the type of force that was used. It was not, as many people thought, a bombing. It was actually the use of a C-130 gunship, which continued to hit the area with 150mm cannon bullets for half an hour or more. And this raises the issue of the disproportionate use of force as well, and a number of other issues under IHL. What I think there have been a number of protests. We back certainly the importance of having an independent fact-finding mission. There is concern that unless that happens, there will be no responsibility assigned for this act. It also needs to be addressed both by the Afghan authorities and by the US authorities and by NATO. At the very least, there are very bad errors in terms of communications, but I think there are far more substantial issues than that. And this is an issue, I think, that both the humanitarian community and the international community will continue to follow up on, because it does, as I said, raise so many issues. People are already concerned about the use of drones and other types of aerial attack, and this is just yet another very sad catalogue that puts humanitarian operations under great stress.
Thanks, Mark. And the statistics you see in front of you in the screen is a sad reality of the difficult and dangerous environment under which we operate, where the respect of the principles or a perception of non-respect for the principles can lead to death for humanitarian workers. You see the statistics for 2014 with 329 aid workers who were victims of major attacks throughout the world. This is put together by the aidworkersecurity.org. And I'm afraid the statistics for 2015 are not any better. It's a grim situation, and in operations like Afghanistan, like in Syria and other parts of the world, Yemen today, our job is increasingly becoming very, very difficult. I'm going to take you now to another question we just received, and I'm going to address it here to Balthazar. And the question, the caller sent the question saying, what if all means of convincing a non-state actor to provide access and humanitarian space are exhausted, and still we see no results from this non-state actor? So the question is there any legal mechanism under the international humanitarian law that could be used in order to ensure compliance with international humanitarian law? Are there any precedents regarding accountability? So really, we're talking about these extremist groups in today's world that these principles somehow do not ring a bell, they're not respected, and how do we go about making sure to bring them on board and ensure that we can reach these people who are in extreme situations? Balthazar, what are your reflections?
I think what is important is that we distinguish on the one hand between international humanitarian law, which is a body of law that bestows obligations but also rights on state and non-state armed actors participating in hostilities, on how they wage the war and what are their rights if they are hors combat, for instance, wounded or taken prisoner. And on the other hand, so here we have, of course, a major problem in today's world, a protection crisis, because international humanitarian law is badly respected, and it is true that we have certain remedial actions on it, which, for instance, is the international criminal justice. So we can have, after certain conflicts, it doesn't happen systematically, but we can have an accountability for people who basically are taken to court for what they have done during wartime in violation of this body of law. And then we have the humanitarian principles, and I think we have to be careful that in the debate we don't conflate the two. The humanitarian principles are a compass and a practical tool for humanitarian actors. And basically the question arises, how can these actors convince the belligerents to allow them to work alongside these principles? Belligerents don't have to subscribe to neutrality. Of course, they are not neutral. They are fighting a war. So I think we have to be careful that we don't confuse the two. One is a body of law, international law. The other one is a body of principles that binds not everybody, but binds the humanitarian actors that want to apply them. And you may have other actors, relief actors, that basically say, I don't want to be humanitarian principled. I want to do relief, and I only want that this relief goes to my group, my faith community. I don't want to give it to the others. That happens, but they shouldn't say that they are genuinely humanitarian actors, because they are not. They provide life-saving relief. It's certainly welcome by the ones who are assisted, but they shouldn't use the label. Now, the question was, what do we do if actors do not give access to humanitarian actors? Is there a law that obliges them to give access? And I think IHL, International Humanitarian Law, basically says that impartial actors, that's the only principle that is mentioned as clearly, may offer their services. But the prime responsibility to serve for the population is indeed with the authority that controls the population. It is particularly clearly stipulated in situations of occupation, but I won't go into details, which basically means that a state that totally takes care of its population, namely, for instance, in a non-international armed conflict, doesn't have an absolute obligation to give access. But mostly in war situations, whoever controls territory doesn't really manage to cover all the needs. And that's where, of course, there is a legitimacy for external actors to offer their services, and I'd say an obligation for actors not to allow that the population starves and to give access to such actors. Now, is there a way to force aid through? I think we have seen it in certain contexts. We have seen it, for instance, in the Balkans in the 90s, where there were militarized convoys that basically tried to push through checkpoints to, in a way, even against hostility of some of the actors, to get the aid through the people. In today's world, if we look at the number of conflicts, if we look at the stretched resources, I think we see less and less of that. And it was quite interesting that recently an officer, and I was on a panel, basically said, I'm astonished that ICC manages to go just without any military escort to Kandahar. If we had to go there, we would use, I don't know how many Humvees, how many soldiers. So he said, actually, it's very efficient what you do. Now, of course, it's not efficiency that is the main driver, but it's true that in today's world, and I'm not saying humanitarian action is the only game in town, but I find it difficult to conceive on who would today commit the resources to basically fight with armed convoys, push through the cross borders and become de facto participants of the war to secure population. I think it would be, from a military point of view already, simply not possible any longer. So there is really a question, what is the plan B? If we basically do not manage to pull off humanitarian principled action in some of the conflict zones, what would be the plan B? Who will be ready to fight through resistance? And that would, of course, be a totally different approach. It would perhaps bring goods to the people, but I think it shouldn't be called humanitarian. So in this sense, what remains to be done is of course, reaching out to these actors, and I would also say reaching out to actors that can influence the actors. Each armed group, each state has allies, has friends, has people one can talk to, and that one can try to reason. So there is a lot of quiet humanitarian diplomacy going on, and I think that must continue, but with some actors it is incredibly difficult or even impossible at this stage. So I'm not at all pretending that humanitarian principled action is, how shall I say, a sort of panacea that responds to everything, but I think it's probably the best solution that we have, namely in the kind of complex armed conflicts that we see today.
Balthasar, as you're speaking, actually one of the listeners is immediately reacted to what you have just said. And there's a follow-up question to what you were describing. The question is about what to do when you work in this complex situation where there is one actor who controls access, who controls who you work with, where you go or not to go. So it's a very controlled environment. And in this case, as a humanitarian actor, you have two choices. You either work with this chosen authority within the parameters of where and how you go, in which case you may be losing your operational independence, or you don't deliver at all. You get out of it and say, I'm not ready to compromise on that. So what's your take? What would you advise in the situation? An overly controlled situation by one actor where you have, in order to get access, to compromise a little bit and work within the parameters of who is the partner, where to go, how to go, or do you just, completely get out of that situation? Over to you.
I think I think it depends, because it's not as clear-cut, perhaps, as the question seems to suggest. It depends very much what are the kind of constraints that are imposed upon you. In the east of Ukraine, ICSC was asked to register. So yes, we accepted registration to work there. But if, for instance, a belligerent said, you can have access to that and that town, but you can only help, say, the injured of one faction and not the others, I think we cannot go in and do that. So it's true that the kind of restrictions and conditions that are posed by belligerents will have to individually assessed and looked at as whether they can be accommodated or not. What I think cannot be done is basically be present in a place, having access to people and then only selectively help certain but not others in a way which would be totally partial. In such a situation, I think it would so much compromise the capacity of the organization to work in that context, but even beyond the context globally, that in such a context, probably negotiations would have to continue to gain a capacity to impartially access according to needs. But what very often happens is that you simply do not have access, say, to one region of the country, and I think it would be wrong in that in such a situation to basically punish the rest of the country and saying we do nothing. But there you have to be honest. I would really say humanitarian actors have to be honest about what they can do, what they cannot do, where they are present, where they are not present, what they do in order to gain access to the places where they do, which they cannot reach. So I think it's a question of transparency. And of course, you get a lot. I remember it was very interesting in Syria. There was a huge debate which has ebbed a little bit on cross-line versus cross-border. And people basically said it's impossible if you don't do cross-border against the will of the Syrian authorities, you totally compromise yourself. Whereas ICRC tried very much to work from within with cross-line operations. We had nearly 30 in the first 6 months of the year out of about 300 field trips, which is, and they are, sometimes it's weeks to negotiate in order that everybody holds the fire if you want to cross over a line. So I think what I always said at the time is basically the very idea that the civilians that you help in a government-held area are all automatically pro-government, and vice versa, that the civilians who would be in a rebel-held area are totally aligned with the political agenda of the rebels, is totally erroneous. Civilians run for their life, and they may end up in a government-held territory or in a rebel-held territory. So there was even almost a sort of debate on, are there good civilians and bad civilians? The fact is, people need help, and humanitarian actors have to use all their astuteness and all their contacts and all their power of persuasion to try to reach as many of them as possible. And it's a tremendous challenge, and I think we have to be very honest also about the limits. But as I said, what would be the alternative to it? What approach would work better?
Thanks, Balthazar, about also a reality check in terms of what we can do or how far we can go. And really, we're not the solution to the political context, and we should not take on our shoulders more than actually than what we ought or we should. We have another question that I'd like to take to Francis in Amman. And Francis, the caller sent a question saying, as humanitarians, when we try to apply these principles, do we call a spade with regards to what's happening in a situation, or do we often compromise too much in order to accommodate governments? What's your view, Francis?
Thanks, Panos. I think this is, again, interesting for those multi-mandated agencies, and in fact everyone, and as someone who's been working in advocacy in different contexts, in Eastern Congo, in Mali and Syria, the key question is really, I think, how far are agencies prepared to go in speaking out against atrocities that they are encountering as they conduct operations versus the risk of being asked to stop operations or being thrown out of the country because of speaking out. Now, and again, I think within each agency, this is a question they have to ask themselves. I think there's an increasing, I think we can say that humanitarian work has certainly become more rights-based, and that, you know, looking for this kind of rights-based and rule-based world order is certainly true. I'm not saying I necessarily particularly have an answer for all agencies. I do think it's something that agencies must look for themselves. And again, this kind of contrast, and where multi-mandated agencies may find it harder, is that there's the humanitarian ethics side of you, which looks at the kind of short-term speed and urgent need, versus the long-term goals and processes of development when you're really trying to prioritize having a long-term presence in country. But again, you know, sometimes this can help if you're working in places where you have already had long-term presence and have good working relationships with all actors in that political spectrum. Being able to talk about abuses, committed atrocities, actually sometimes you are able to do so What's interesting, particularly in the Syria context, however, is I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, naming and shaming, and then the integration of human rights into the humanitarian approach. Naming and shaming in the Syria context, in a lot of other countries it does work. Those actors who are interested in being well perceived by the international community, either as a legitimate alternative to state rule in some civil conflict, they are concerned about how their actions are perceived by the international community. Others, however, and some of the Syrian conflict, quite frankly, don't care if they end up on the MRM. And indeed, we have blocks at the Security Council level from getting the Syrian government on a list of those actors who we know are committing violations, particularly against child rights. I think what can be done about this, something I've been delighted to see in the Syria conflict, is this very intentional integration of human rights organizations who, as we know, if they're not operational in country, don't face the same dilemma of thinking to themselves, okay, well, is our response to those in need going to be jeopardized by us speaking out against atrocities? With a data gathering, which is hugely important, but it doesn't necessarily jeopardize their operations, I think they've played a fantastic role in speaking out against atrocities. Interestingly, in the Syria context, now humanitarian coordinators and residential humanitarian coordinators are getting human rights staff seconded to them to work with them. So we're really seeing this integration of humanitarian rights and ways of thinking, humanitarian rights advocacy, truly integrating the humanitarian approach. I think that's a really strong development and something that I think hopefully will make a difference. Again, I'm not necessarily I have an answer for do we call a spade and how far do you compromise not speaking out versus your ability to access people in need. But I think generally we do have a responsibility as humanitarians working in the field, witnessing those atrocities and abuses that are happening, to bring them to bear witness to them, to bring them to the forefront. Thanks.
Thanks, Francis. I'm going actually to take us now to Kabul, and the next question is for Mark. Mark, one of the callers says, in this webinar, nobody has mentioned the role of the affected people, the people we're trying to help in applying these principles. Can you tell us in the Afghanistan context how the affected people are informed, engaged, participate, contribute? Obviously, they are victims of the conflict, yet their understanding of the principles and the position of humanitarian workers is crucial. Can you share with us the Afghanistan experience? Mark, over to you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think that the Afghanistan people have suffered from conflict for over 35 years, and as part of that, I think that there is a very strong and increasing civil society component that's spreading throughout the country. And one of the main ways of increasing understanding and knowledge is increasingly through civil society. I think we tend to generalize quite a lot about civil society, but I think Francis was talking about human rights. There's a lot more discussion of human rights across the board in Afghanistan now, in civil society, and a lot more activity on this side. But I think that the issue of humanitarian principles has entered into the civil society discourse. Civil society organizations, as I said, are developing, but still remain, some areas have less engagement or are put under a lot more pressure, depending on the part of the country that you're in. So I think that part of our role is to both support and promote civil society and to make them the major vehicle for making us as both humanitarian organizations accountable, but also to increase the accountability on belligerent groups and others, along with humanitarian principles. As I said, I think we've seen some examples of this developing in the sort of latest responses to some of the conflict that's taking place. Over to you.
Thanks. I'd like actually to take, there is another delicate question that we've just received, and it's addressed to ICRC. And the question is about respecting the principles, and Balthazar, you spoke earlier on also about the role of donors and funding. So the caller is sending a question to say, in some of today's complex conflicts, for example, Yemen, have you had a position where you would accept or reject a funding by a state who may have a direct involvement in a military operation that takes place in the same context? And I think the question is related to possibly the Gulf region. So how would you handle a situation where funding is available, yet that funding may be a question related to the neutrality of the donor, where the money is coming from? Balthazar, and I think this is a challenge for all of us, obviously, as we go through here. Balthazar, over to you.
What is very important is, of course, to have as wide a funding basis as possible. What is interesting that, for instance, a number of high contracting parties to the Geneva Convention give sometimes token amounts to the ICSC, even not the traditional funders, just in a way to recognize that a mandate was given to the ICSC in conflict zones. So they often give us relatively small amounts made for headquarters, but it's politically significant. This being said, we still have a predominantly Western funding basis as ICSC, even if not one state has any dominant role. So in this sense, what is interesting, if you take, for instance, the example of Syria, we have in Syria received contributions from Western states, but also from Russia for our operations. And of course, that is, in a way, politically speaking, significant, because it means that perhaps countries that have different views on what should be the outcome of this war and different sympathies for belligerents have financed the ICSC. So I think what is important in terms of the funds is not so much where they come from, but do they come with strings attached or not? And as I said, ICSC would not accept funds that come with strings attached, that would not allow us to do impartial humanitarian action. That means we come back to the question of the earmarking. Earmarking, tightly earmarked, we have a policy that we would not accept. Tight earmarking. We'd not accept someone to basically say, we only support this and this hospital, we only support operations in this part of the country or the other. We would have to reject it. So afterwards, what then people see is what you do on the ground, and you can immediately see whether the funds that you receive allow you to deliver upon your commitment for impartial humanitarian action. It is, of course, a constant challenge to convince the donors to give you non-earmarked money. They have also accountability issues with their public opinion. They have to render account that the money is well spent. So you have to be credible in terms of how you operate in order to have the sufficient trust of the donors, in order that they give you the kind of free hand and trust that allows you to make the determination. So obviously, we do have sometimes contributions from countries, even if they are actively engaged, but not with any strings attached. And of course, you have to be very careful that you don't have an enormous amount of funding from one of the belligerents for your operation, because then it's becoming almost impossible to explain to the different groups and stakeholders on the ground that you are indeed not under anybody's boots. So it's a reputational risk that you have to manage, and you have to be transparent and accountable on it.
Thanks, Balthazar. I'd like to let you know we're actually opening now a poll. We're in the last 10 minutes of this webinar. I'd like to ask you, as you're listening to the last round of questions, if you could please take a minute and give us your view in terms of how you found this webinar. We constantly try to improve, so your feedback is really very important for us. Tell us what you liked, what you would have liked to hear maybe more, and also what future topics you would like us to take on board. Mark, I have a question which is addressed to you in Afghanistan. In your role as a resident coordinator, you have to deal with the government and, of course, have an excellent cooperation. At the same time, wearing your humanitarian coordinator hat, you have to talk with the non-state actors and, of course, to bring the donors and everybody else on board in a very complex situation. Do you see a conflict of interest when you try to address these principles with these different groups? How do you juggle all these different balls on your day-to-day work when wearing the different hats? Over to you.
I think it is a challenging environment in which to work. I think that, fortunately for me, part of that is helped by the fact that I work in an environment where we have managed to separate out the humanitarian from the political processes as much as possible. I have to say that I think in all environments there will be a confusion of political issues and the humanitarian debate, but we have separate tracks here which we stick quite rigorously to, and I'm fortunate in that at least on the UN side, there's a clear observance of that separation of interest, which is not always the case. I think there's potentially more difficulty with the donor side because and on the funding side, because I think as we broaden definitions of humanitarians, and I'm very much on the side of the ICRC on this, where I think a narrower humanitarian definition is actually far more helpful, but we actually are working in an environment where there is a broader humanitarian agenda pursued, which is not unrelated to the funding environment. And that's where I think we need to be far clearer. Many agencies and organizations outside the ICRC are involved in both development, humanitarian, and possibly even human rights activities. And we need to be careful in our own discussions as to how we use those funding sources and how we better manage them as more separate streams, and don't just try to maximize our overall agency resources. So I see that as one sort of significant challenge. The other issue is working with the donor community to ensure that there is respect for principles, and there I think we need to highlight the importance of a good humanitarian donorship agenda. It seems to be less talked about now than it was a few years ago, and I think it's important to re-establish that discussion of the good humanitarian donorship agenda so that we avoid some of the conditionalities that have crept into the way in which financing works. So I see my role very much as seeking to advocate and to try to manage those separate streams as separate streams in all our best interests.
Thanks, Mark. Indeed, not an easy task to do given the complexity of the ground. The next question we have received is from a caller and is to Balthazar. And Balthazar, the caller says, we're working in the OPT, a protracted situation, the longest crisis that has gone now for 3 generations, parents, grandparents, children, grandparents growing up in refugee camps in a situation where we see more and more in today's world complex, protracted situations where they go for years with generations without a solution. And there is a sense of, the caller says, we have a sense a certain fatigue, that over time we almost give up on this principle, we almost give up on it, because there is a sense of failure or unwillingness, or not the situation not leading to any solution. And the people themselves, you talked about the affected people, the people themselves have almost given up to it. So how do you deal with this protracted crisis that go forever, where the principles, yes, we try to deliver them, but after time there is a certain fatigue, both on behalf of the humanitarian actors and the people we're trying to do, and all actors on the ground. So how to deal with this crisis, like the OPT Palestinian-Israeli conflict? Balthasar, over to you.
It's an excellent question, and I think there is one big dilemma. We see more and more protracted crises that go on for decades, and where there is an enormous frustration. And they mirror not so much, I would argue, a failure of humanitarian actors, because humanitarian actors never had the capacity, nor even how shall I say, a mandate to fix conflict zones. But it's a absence of a political convergence that we see today, where it becomes extremely difficult to fix, if you allow me the term, conflict zones, and to build sustainable, peaceful solutions, which means people are often in a sort of protracted crisis that just does not end. And clearly, humanitarian actors do not have the answers and cannot substitute for a glaring lack of political action and international convergence in today's world to lead these situations to something better. The question is, of course, then, as a humanitarian actor, living up to the principles, would it be better if you were partial, for instance? Of course, impartiality remains totally relevant. You would want to work, even if situations last for decades, according to the principles of impartiality, that you serve the most needy ones, rather than making any kind of discrimination, which would certainly not help to improve the situation. But where we have a dilemma, it's really along the element of how does development and humanitarian action play together. If you speak development, you speak very often of a design, of a desired end state. What political system do you want to build? What structure do you want to build? What state do you want to build? And it's true that humanitarian actors, principal humanitarian actors, must refrain from getting too close to a sort of development agenda, because a development agenda is by definition highly political, and which means it has the backing of some and the rejection of others, depending on what end game you aim for. However, this being said, if you work, for instance, with health structures, and a situation lasts 20, 30 years, you can't just do sort of expatriate nurses that come in and do emergency response. You start to build capacity, and we try, of course, to invest particularly with the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies in each and every country. They will be around. They share our principles that we have established as the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. So we have, for instance, heavily invested in the ambulance system of the Palestine Red Crescent Society, which does absolutely formidable work for the Palestinian population. So you create capacity, but not in a way that you would take any political stance on what is the outcome. And I think there is a tension between an approach, even if you help also health structures, you mount capacity of clinics, etc. You may do a type of work that starts to look a little bit like developmental, but you have to be very careful that this type of work is in relatively well-defined areas where you don't, in a way, get entangled into a kind of state building of a more political nature. And I think that is probably a effort as principled action is, in a more general way, to contextualize, to in a way constantly soul search, reflect upon what you do, the impact it has, how it is perceived, to stick as close as you can to the essence of these principles, while finding responses that in the way they are operationalized make perfect sense, or as good sense as possible.
Balthasar, thank you. That was indeed a difficult situation, and with the protractedness, many countries, we have 35 countries who are listening to this webinar, and indeed I'm sure many can relate to Colleagues, I'm afraid we have run out of time, so it's already 90 minutes are over. I hope you have all taken a minute to answer to the poll that will remain open for a few more minutes after the closing of this webinar. I'd like to say a warm welcome and thank you to all our three panelists who did a superb job at sharing their reflections. A big thank you to Francis Charles, who joined us from Amman, Jordan. Francis, the Advocacy Director for the World Vision's Syria Crisis Response. I want to say a big thank you to Mark Bowden, the Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General, who is the resident and humanitarian coordinator and joined us from Kabul in Afghanistan. And also a big thank you to Baltasar Stahelin, who is the Deputy Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross and joined us here with me in Geneva. I want to say a big thank you to all the participants who stayed with us throughout this webinar. We hope you found it useful and practical in your work. So I want to say from me, Panos Mumsis, the facilitator of this discussion, I want to say a big thank you to all of you and wish you all the very best. Goodbye from us here in Geneva.